Assessment quality is a key issue for all assessment use, regardless of whether an assessment is used by a teacher to help determine which concepts her students have understood and areas where they need more support, or by district-level administrators to determine the effectiveness of a newly implemented curriculum. In this lesson, we will examine the most important issues for evaluating assessment quality: validity, reliability, bias, and usability. Validity is the key issue in assessment quality. The other three criteria that you will learn about in this lesson are, in fact, all components of validity. Validity is concerned with whether an assessment is measuring what it is intended to measure. To this end, an assessment has a high degree of validity if the interpretation of results can serve well the intended purpose of the assessment. It is important to note that validity is not a characteristic of a test. Rather, it has to do with the trustworthiness of the claims that are made on the basis of the test results. In other words, validity refers to the interpretations of the test results rather than to the test itself. Take, for example, an assessment designed to measure reading comprehension. This test will yield results, which the teacher will first interpret and then use these interpretations to make decisions about student learning. Since the test is designed to measure reading comprehension, interpretations from these test results are only valid when used to inform decisions regarding reading comprehension, and not spelling or fluency, for example. When considering validity evidence, it is helpful to map out the relationship between the different types of validity. Construct validity encompasses all of the other types of validity. Content validity, criterion validity, and consequential validity all contribute to the degree of construct validity of the interpretation of scores. Content validity refers to how well the sample of test tasks represent the learning domain to be measured. For example, if you are using a test designed to diagnose difficulties that a student might be having with proportional reasoning, then you will need to be sure that the tasks on the test you select are a representative sample of the domain of proportional reasoning. For example, questions that provide evidence of the student's ability to distinguish between features of a proportional relationship that can change and those that must stay the same. An important factor to consider when assessing content validity is alignment. Alignment is the degree to which the learning expectations and the learning assessments used to measure whether or not students are meeting the expectations are matched. For example, if you are using diagnostic testing to determine what problems students may be encountering in attaining proficiency on state standards, it is important that the tests you select are relevant to state standards, even though they may not be directly aligned to grade-level content standards. Consequential validity measures whether or not the test results in the intended consequences. For example, a diagnostic test aims to provide information upon which subsequent instruction can be based, and after further tailored instruction, students should be able to overcome the problems or challenges the diagnosis revealed. If the diagnostic test does not lead to advances in student learning, the consequential validity of the interpretations of the test results is called into question. The last subcategory that falls under construct validity, criterion validity, involves evaluating the relationship between the test and other measures of the construct, for example, behavior or an existing validated test, that the test is intended to measure. Criterion validity consists of concurrent, predictive, convergent, and divergent validity. Concurrent validity is important for a test that estimates student current status in learning. Evidence of the relationship between the test and the criterion tests is obtained concurrently to assess students' current skill level. Predictive validity is important for tests that predict students' future achievement. In this case, evidence of the relationship between the test and the criterion test is obtained over an extended period of time. The method of collecting evidence for concurrent and predictive validity is the same. The only difference is the time period within which the evidence is obtained. Convergent validity and divergent validity refer to the degree to which the test correlates with another test measuring either the same construct or a different construct, respectively. For example, an assessment used to measure reading skills that shows a strong correlation to an established reading assessment measure has a high degree of convergent validity. If the same reading skills assessment shows a low correlation to an established math assessment measure, it has a high degree of divergent validity. When considering validity evidence, it is important to remember that assessments have different degrees of validity. They are not simply valid or invalid. Additionally, keep in mind that no test is valid for all purposes. That is, the validity evidence of a particular assessment needs to be reviewed in light of its intended purpose. With the overarching issue in assessment quality, validity, in mind, we are now going to discuss reliability. Reliability refers to how consistently an assessment measures what it is intended to measure, and how consistent the results are, irrespective of changes in the assessment situation. For example, changes in the time of administration, changes in the day and time of scoring, changes in who scores the assessment, or changes in the sample of assessment items included. For example, if two different scorers arrive at different results from the same diagnostic mathematics assessment, the assessment may not have high reliability. Keep in mind that reliability is necessary, but it is not a sufficient condition for validity. That is, for an assessment to have a high degree of validity, it must be highly reliable. However, an assessment can be highly reliable without having a high degree of validity. This diagram demonstrates the relationship between reliability and validity discussed in the previous slide. An assessment may have a high degree of reliability, that is, it consistently measures what it is intended to measure, and provides consistent results. However, it may still have a low degree of validity if it is not appropriately aligned to the purpose for which it is intended. Therefore, it is necessary to evaluate an assessment for the degree to which they are valid and reliable. You may now be asking yourself, how will I know how reliable a particular assessment is? When you are considering an assessment that your school, district, or state has purchased, the test developers will have included a reliability coefficient value along with the test materials. The reliability coefficient is represented by the letter R and is expressed as a number ranging from 0 to 1. When R equals 0, this indicates no reliability, while R equals 1 indicates perfect reliability. Refer to the table for general guidelines for interpreting test reliability. The larger the reliability coefficient, the more reliable the test results. When considering the reliability of an assessment, it is important to note that no assessment result is perfectly consistent or reliable. Sources of random measurement error can influence assessment results, and an indication of reliability is the degree to which test results are unaffected by random measurement errors. Sources of random measurement error fall into three categories: student-specific factors, for example, motivation, concentration, or anxiety; test-specific factors, for example, differences in test forms, ambiguous items, or unclear directions; and scoring-specific factors, such as differences in rater judgment or computational errors. To the extent that you can reduce these sources of random measurement error, this will help in preserving the reliability of the results. The third assessment quality issue to consider is bias. Bias refers to characteristics of an assessment, or assessment items, that are related to the assessment target but that get in the way of some students showing what they know. Bias is evident when students with the same ability but from different demographic groups respond differently to particular test items. Test bias arises when deficiencies in the test or in the manner in which the test is used result in different meanings for scores achieved by members of different subgroups. For example, subgroups defined by race, ethnicity, language, culture, gender, disability, or socioeconomic status. Offensiveness and unfair penalization are two forms of test bias. Offensiveness occurs when the content of a test offends, upsets, or distresses particular subgroups, thus negatively influencing the test performance of these students. Test items that present stereotypes of girls, boys, or particular cultures, or that portray certain groups as inferior, could adversely affect the performance of certain subgroups. Unfair penalization occurs when the test content makes the test more difficult for some students than for others due to cultural, geographic, or socioeconomic differences. For example, a test with vocabulary related to rural life may disadvantage students from the inner city and advantage students from rural communities. Other examples of this bias are a test with images more familiar to students from a higher socioeconomic status than to students from a lower socioeconomic status, or math and science assessments that use complex language. The first test would favor students from a higher socioeconomic status and hinder the students from a lower socioeconomic status, while the complex language in the math and science assessments may interfere with English learners' ability to understand what is being asked or to respond appropriately. Given the potential for bias to adversely affect assessment results, and thus lead to unsound educational decisions drawn from the interpretations of these results, both test developers and those using the assessments need to be sensitive to the demographic characteristics of students. Test developers should provide documentation of steps taken during the test development to minimize bias that will be useful to you, as the user, when deciding appropriate assessments to use. The final component of assessment quality that we're going to cover is usability. Even though a test may be valid, reliable, and free from bias, it may not be appropriate or feasible to use in your particular situation. Usability issues include ease of interpretation and utility of results and reporting methods, test administration requiring specific training, the time for administering the tests exceeding what is reasonable, the test being too expensive to purchase or too complicated to score, and the test having requirements that are beyond the capacity of the school or classroom, for example, test conditions or extra resources needed to interpret results. Some questions to ask yourself when considering usability are: first, is specific training required to administer the test? Second, how much time does it take to administer the test? Third, how are the results from the test scored? Fourth, how are the results of the test interpreted? And finally, are the scores reported in ways that will be helpful to you and enable you to determine what is needed for groups and individuals? Keeping these questions in mind will ensure that you end up with an assessment that is usable and will therefore provide accurate information from which to base future educational decisions. You will now complete a short activity to check your understanding of assessment quality. When you have finished, you will be ready to move on to Lesson 2. Congratulations! You have now completed Lesson 1. Please continue on to Lesson 2, the purposes and uses of interim assessments.